welcome to one and all. This is episode 173 in the car of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me for this car ride on this Wednesday here in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, turn on those notifications. So we're having another nostalgia kind of an on this day, very important and pivotal day in the history of motion pictures. On May 1st, 1941, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane had its world premiere at the RKO Palace Theater in New York City. Theater which is still there to this day, I might add. Now, Citizen Kane is generally regarded to be the most important film in the history of cinema. Welles pioneered certain filming and filmmaking techniques and certain ideas that other filmmakers had maybe teased but hadn't quite figured out. And he just flat out pioneered certain bits of camera trickery and editing techniques, forced perspectives, rear projection. He did a lot of stuff, not only stuff that hadn't been done, but he did it really well. He figured out how to optimize 1940-41 era movie cameras. The movie cameras always had the ability to do deep focus, rack focusing, swish pans. Well, Welles was the first guy with his cinematographer, Greg Toland. He figured out how to optimize. He figured out how to get the most out of the equipment with which he was working. And there's a lot to be said for that. He was a trailblazer. He was a pioneer. Unfortunately, because of Citizen Kane, he didn't have the career that he should have, because Citizen Kane was not even loosely based. It was not in name, but it was based on the life of the multimillionaire publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst. And as the movie was in production and being prepared, Hearst got wind of it. He started a lengthy character assassination of Orson Welles with the intent for the film to never be released. If he had had his way, every print would have been destroyed, or the original negative would have been destroyed, and there would have been no prints at all. Fortunately for art, for history, Hearst was not able to succeed with that, but he did succeed in damaging Welles' reputation in Hollywood. He was a kid. He was 25 years old when he started work on Citizen Kane. He even made a joke of it was the biggest train set that a kid ever had to play with, that he was able to make this movie and do what he wanted. He was already considered sort of boy genius. Welles was a classic triple threat. There are very few true triple threats who have ever worked in Hollywood. And by that, I mean an incredible writer, an extraordinary filmmaker, and a great actor. And Orson Welles was all three of those things. You can name certain major figures in Hollywood that were home run hitters in two of the three. Very few. You could say all three. I would say the closest probably be Woody Allen. But there are plenty of people that have always thought that Woody was just a lousy film actor, so they wouldn't include him. But Woody was, in his own way, a groundbreaking, trailblazing filmmaker. He did shit in the late 60s and early 70s that nobody had really done before, the way that he was breaking all kinds of filmmaking rules and getting away with it. And obviously, multiple Oscar-winning writer, director, and Annie Hall winning Best Picture. But for example, Quentin Tarantino, an extraordinary writer, and an extraordinary filmmaker, one of the greats to ever work in the medium. He's not really that good of an actor. I would say that even people who would argue that Woody Allen is not that great of an actor, he's a better actor than Quentin Tarantino. Most people would agree. Again, this is just a matter of opinion. But Orson Welles was a Grand Slam home run hitter in all three of those disciplines. And he had started in the theater, and famously, what is now known as the War of the Worlds broadcast, where he broadcast a radio program. Was it Halloween night? I think it was Halloween night. It was some kind of, maybe it was New Year's night, but it was a big night. And he broadcast this iteration of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds as if, the aliens are coming and we're all going to die. And thousands of people thought we were actually under attack. The kind of commitment to realism, Orson Welles pulled it off. So fortunately, as I said, Citizen Kane was released, and it had this big splashy world premiere in New York City, much to the chagrin of William Randolph Hearst and his kind of lackey, the gossip columnist who had a ton of connections, Hedda Hopper. The critical reception to Citizen Kane was significant. Critics liked it. Even those who were maybe afraid, if they worked for a Hearst newspaper, they might have had to mute their praise. But the movie was successful at the box office, and there was an idea, if you go back, all of this stuff is available. See, in the Stone Ages, when I was in film school in the mid-1990s, the internet existed, but we had to look up the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, microfilm, microfiche. Now this information is available on the internet. You can look up contemporary newspaper accounts from 1941, whether it's the New York Times, for example, whether it's the Brooklyn Eagle, and you will see that there was a general sense that Citizen Kane was something different, something that we had not seen. Not that there hadn't been great movies. I mean, hell, The Wizard of Oz, what an incredible film, not that long before. And but the idea was, this was different, and maybe Orson Welles was too far ahead of his time, and even attempting this, you would say, was career suicide. But that he achieved something that was not normal, that was revolutionary. And so the film was a success financially, despite the protestations of Hearst Publishing and everybody connected to him. And the movie was nominated for 9 Oscars, so there was a sense that this was a great film. Orson won for screenplay, and I feel like even that was an upset. And if you want to throw the Tarantino reference in there, it's like Tarantino only winning for screenplay when Pulp Fiction. I mean, I love Shawshank, I love Forrest Gump, I love Shawshank more than Forrest Gump, but it's absurd that Pulp Fiction only won an Oscar for screenplay, and Quentin shared that with his writing partner Roger Avary, who's contributed significant chunks, at least I believe 20 to 30% of what became Pulp Fiction was Roger Avary's work as well. So Orson won for best screenplay at the Oscars, which would have taken place like late winter, early spring 1942. And if I'm not mistaken, he was booed when he won. And that, even something as stupid and petty and childish as that, we talk about people acting petty and childish now. This is 82 years ago, and they're booing this guy. What is he, 26 years old? Everyone knew that he had a stupendous amount of talent and busted his tail on that movie, and they're booing him. How pathetic is that? Well, he got booed, and he won his screenplay Oscar. And I've seen pictures of Orson's typewriter. It's not surprisingly, it was a significant collector's item. It's just so quaint to think that some of the greatest works of cinema, you had editing mistakes, you had spelling errors. It's nothing like, when the first word processor came out, it was the most extraordinary thing, late 70s, early 80s. Holy shit, you don't need editing tape anymore. Wow. So Citizen Kane as a movie, because obviously I want to talk about the movie itself, I am not really a fan. And not surprisingly, as a film school graduate who loved movies even before he got to film school, I've watched Citizen Kane more than you have, most likely. I have studied it in significant detail. I wrote 2 papers, significant term papers, on the movie, not on the same topic. I appreciate its place in cinema history. And if I'm asked the question, not what's the greatest movie ever made, what is the most culturally, historically important motion picture in the history of cinema, my answer is Citizen Kane, for many of the reasons that I just mentioned. Do I like the film? Not really. It is a difficult movie to love, in part because the character of Charles Foster Kane, the William Randolph Hearst character, played by, as I say so beautifully, by Orson Welles himself, he's not exactly the most likable guy, and the movie jumps back and forth through time in a bit of a Pulp Fiction-ish structure, where it always keeps us off balance. And this is one of the beauties of it in its way, and one of the beauties of Pulp Fiction and movies of that ilk where there are the time jumps. You don't really know exactly where you are in the story, because normally by chronological, seeing how old a character is, for example, you know where you are. That doesn't work in Pulp Fiction. That doesn't work in Citizen Kane. I find the film to be difficult to really get into. And my very first time seeing it, see, this is interesting. Well, I hope that you find this interesting. I had seen pieces of Citizen Kane as a kid. It's not something that was on HBO. I wouldn't have wanted to watch it with a bunch of commercials. You know, you have channels like HBO, the movie channel, Cinemax, back in the day when that was the only game in town, that and VHS. You wanted to see a movie from start to finish. And when I turned 18, for turning 18, my father got me a really thoughtful gift. He got me the Citizen Kane 50th anniversary collector's set. I don't know if it was called a collector's set, but that's basically what it was. What it contained was a couple of mock keepsakes from the film. In other words, like little pieces of history that weren't the real pieces of history from the film. They were like copies of pieces of history. There were 2 books, one of which discussed the production of the film in significant detail, and the other was just kind of a scrapbook of behind the scenes photos, like, you know, something along those lines, and a really good VHS copy of the film. That was the technology of the day. Laserdisc existed, but very few people in 1991. I didn't know anybody that had a Laserdisc player. You know, Laserdisc could have been DVD, but it just didn't catch on. It just didn't catch on. Again, it's neither here nor there. But we got that. Dad bought that for me because I had shown such an interest in cinema. I was already reading Roger Ebert's Book of Film. I read 2 Roger Ebert movie home companions. I watched Siskel and Ebert. I was interested in reading the reviews in the local New York newspapers back then. And I had bought a number of books. I bought a few books on Clint Eastwood. I bought a book on, you know, great action movies. I was interested. So Dad got me this gift. And we watched the movie. And it's weird that I was already considered such a film buff. I was just turning 18. But I hadn't seen Citizen Kane all the way through. We watched it, and I mean, the movie is not really fun. It's not. There are other great movies which to me are great entertainments that have a rewatchability factor. Now, Citizen Kane has a rewatchability factor, but more for somebody like me because I understand the historical import, and I also remember the papers I wrote and the pieces and components of the film that I focused on in those papers. But if you ask me, you like the movie? Yeah, I love the movie, but I don't love watching it. I've always found it to be a bit stiff, and the unlikable kind of asshole protagonist, it cuts down on the fun factor. If anything, it takes the fun factor completely away, at least for me. It is a movie that I respect, but I don't love. And I've said that about other films. Goodfellas is one of the great movies of the last, 40 years. I don't love it. It's fantastic, but I don't love it. Silence of the Lambs, great film. Not really a fan. I can go the rest of my life without ever watching Silence of the Lambs again. Now, Citizen Kane, I wouldn't put it in that category because it's the kind of movie that I would share with others if people showed interest. Absolutely. And I'll try not to talk your ear off the whole way through. But the basic story for those who have heard of the movie, and I would think the younger you are, the less likely it is that you've seen the movie. The basic setup is you have Kane, who is somebody who inherits an enormous amount of money, becomes a huge financial success, brilliant man, hobnobs and schmoozes with kings and presidents and dictators and some really amazing people and some really horrendous people, goes into the publishing business, makes even more money. He's one of the wealthiest men in the world, but ultimately, he's really not that much of a people person. He is as a much younger man when he's in his 20s. As he gets older, he becomes more and more frustrated and aggravated with life. And he finds that money will open it, not surprisingly, an enormous amount of doors, but it won't make you any less miserable. And the film, that's kind of a pretty serious gut punch. Not something that clicked for me when I was in my teens, even in film school, watching it in at least 3 different classes and doing outside research on the film. That didn't land the same way that it would now. When you're a kid, everybody's paying for everything, and you're going to school. You don't have the kinds of responsibilities. Now, he lived a completely different life because he had so much damn money to start, like a Howard Hughes kind of a situation. But he's just not happy. And no matter what he does, he's still not going to feel fulfilled. And you could say, well, it's because he didn't have a conventional childhood. There was a little bit of arrested development. He misses his mom, whatever it might be. Rosebud. But the movie is ultimately, it's not a happy story. It is a story of stupendous achievement, but it's not a happy story. And he may not be the most likable guy, but you can feel for him. He's not horrible. He's not an awful man, but you can feel for him and see the kind of tragic aspects, because there are people who have a shit ton of money, have made it, maybe even self-made, unlike him, who was handed this unbelievable, just a ton of money, who are not miserable, who may have ups and downs, but at the end of their life, they're not necessarily going to say, I should have got more out of it. And it isn't that he would say that necessarily, but that he probably had a number of points, decision points, where he turned right when he should have turned left and vice versa. And misses his mom. He misses the childhood that he didn't really have. It was kind of a childhoodus interruptus, if you will. When I think of the papers I wrote on this film, it's very, very tricky. We had a lot of pressure on us. Schoolwork wasn't that difficult. New York University, they weren't trying to flunk us. But the way that they constructed tests, it was often a pressure cooker to try to see if we could think fast. Yes, we wrote papers, but the final exams for 2 classes, where Citizen Kane was a main piece of the final. They had us watch a clip. One class had us watch a 1-minute clip from Citizen Kane. He has the sled, and this is a point where we realize he's just inherited an incredible amount of money, and he's going to be on his own very soon. We watched this clip, and we had a booklet of essay questions, and we had 2.5 hours to fill a booklet, old-fashioned chicken scratch, 6 or 7 page essay answering one of the questions. I would much prefer to write a 20-page paper than doing that. But I remember that. I remember having to do that, and it didn't necessarily take away from my enjoyment of the film. I didn't find the movie entertaining to begin with. I believe that it's free. It's free on Max. I know that it has been because it's a Turner Classic movie. It's part of their library. I recommend everybody see this movie. But I also recommend people check out some of Orson Welles' other work, Orson Welles was one of the most, I mean, he and Kubrick, I would say, he and Kubrick and Hitchcock were, to me, the three most important figures in a history of cinema, in the evolution and revolution of cinema. I would assume that Welles's IQ was at least 160. They claimed that Kubrick's was closer to 180, that Kubrick was, as I like to say, there are really smart people, and then there's guys like Stanley Kubrick. He would have split the atom if he hadn't been in the movie business. That's how smart he was. But Orson Welles, I don't want to say came back from Citizen Kane, but he just took such a beating over this. He made his next movie, which was Magnificent Ambersons, which is the single most tragic lost film in the history of cinema. And I mean, you want to talk about Erich von Stroheim's fabled 9 to 10 hour cut of the movie Greed? Fine. But that's still pretty fucking obscure, because the average person, even a big film fan, has not seen the 2.5 hour cut of Greed and probably doesn't know that there was a 9 to 10 hour cut that was taken away. No shit. Irving Thalberg, you want to know why Irving Thalberg died so young? That was probably the reason. When he realized that his director, von Stroheim, was supposed to make a 2.5 hour movie, and he shows up with a 9.5 hour cut. GTFOH! You gotta be fucking kidding me. But sadly, in the case of Magnificent Ambersons, people who saw Welles's, it was about a 2 hour and 20 something minute cut. People who saw it said it was better than Citizen Kane. It was going to be more significant, and it told a more well-rounded story, and that there was more sense of humanity. And a fucking studio took the movie away, and the only version of Magnificent Ambersons that exists is, I don't know, it's about 90 to 95 minutes. That is perhaps the greatest cinematic crime ever committed, because we see now, you have films taken away from filmmakers. Even in the 80s, Ridley Scott had Legend taken away from him. They were able to restore Scott's vision, including Jerry Goldsmith's incredible musical score. When I tell you that people have been looking for the full cut of Magnificent Ambersons for decades, they are still looking for it. They are not going to find it. It is gone. It is lost. And that is really terrible. It's horrendous. So Orson Welles continued to work, but he pretty much exiled himself to Europe. He was so frustrated by the fact that he couldn't get his movies done and made the way that he wanted to make them. See, he's a guy who nowadays, he would have simply gone the independent route. He would have had a career like a John Sayles, who worked within the studio system in the 70s and then said, fuck those motherfuckers and their fucking notes. That's literally what he said. But he had enough people who respected him and loved his work. He was able to work on his own, somewhat within the system, but somewhat outside the system. And I feel like Welles was just there at the wrong time. He could have made a movie like Citizen Kane at another time, and it would have been controversial, but he would not have gotten fucked with to the extent that he was. At least I don't believe he would have been, because we've seen big filmmakers from Tarantino on down be polarizing, piss off a lot of people, but not have their careers completely fucked. And Welles, as an actor, appeared in Carol Reed's, also with Joseph Cotten in that movie, The Third Man, which is one of the great films of the 1940s, late 40s. And Orson was just an actor in that, although he supposedly crafted a speech for his character, who was a character called Harry Lime. And it's a cuckoo clock speech. And it's a top 10 great moments in the history of cinema, Orson Welles' cuckoo clock speech. And it tells very quickly a pretty brutal story and paints history in a pretty unfortunate light, basically saying that just because there is murder and mayhem and bloodshed, it doesn't mean that great things aren't also happening. Because look at Switzerland. They had 400 years of peace and brotherhood. They had love and harmony, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. And then Orson kind of smiles at the camera. But Welles continued to kind of work in and around Hollywood, and people were waiting for him to make the big comeback. He never really did. He took a couple of jobs he shouldn't have. He narrated a documentary on Nostradamus, which a lot of us saw. Like, my first exposure to Orson Welles was fucking Nostradamus documentary. And we learned about the War of the Worlds thing in school, but I didn't learn about Citizen Kane. I knew what it was, talked about it, but I didn't see it until, as I said, until I was 18 years old. His career is tragic. The entire arc. The fact that he had so much talent and such an incredible capacity to push himself beyond rational limits from the creative perspective. He just got fucked with repeatedly, was not able to do what he wanted to do. But at the same time, he engendered enormous respect within the movie industry. And sometimes, because Stanley Kubrick ran into this too, it isn't just people not liking you. It's show business. And when you think about the amount of money that Stanley Kubrick made Warner Brothers over the years, whether it was The Shining, whether it was Full Metal Jacket, and the amount of respect that the big bosses at Warner had for him in the 90s when he was preparing AI, and he basically said, we can't let you do it, Stanley. It's going to be prohibitively expensive. Wells had projects. He had ideas for movies in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. It was easier for him to just shoot stuff on the cheap, just because people think that you're a genius and respect you. If they don't think they can turn a profit, they're not going to fund your work. It's like with anything else. Now, Steven Spielberg ended up being able to make AI because by that point he had DreamWorks and he still had Amblin Entertainment and he had the connections to make it happen. But Warner Brothers didn't want to spend $175 to $200 million in the mid-1990s to make a movie they weren't sure anybody was going to go see. Sad but true. And an unfortunate reality. Orson Welles just kept running it against the system. And he really didn't want to do that. He didn't want people with the sway and the ability to take his work away from him. And unfortunately, there are very few filmmakers that have final cut. And even when you have final cut, you usually don't exactly have final cut. There's always another voice that might do something. James Cameron can give you chapter and verse on the number of movies from The Abyss that he had to make adjustments. You know, Jim, we can't release a 3-hour movie the height of summer movie season. We can't do it. Whatever the case might be. Scorsese nearly getting Goodfellas taken away from him. Could you fucking imagine that? The Warner Brothers executives convinced that Marty has made a stink bomb. We're just going to have to write it off. They were that close. Sometimes the powers that be know what they're doing, just as often as not. They're throwing darts at a board. They might think they know, but just as often as not, they're wrong. They don't know. But in the case of Orson Welles and Citizen Kane, he made a masterpiece. And unfortunately, that masterpiece kind of ruined his career and destroyed his career before it really got going. Even with all the acclaim and with people to this day saying that's the single most important figure in the history of movies, in the development, evolution of movies. It's Orson Welles. That's the guy. Everything flowed from him, from the techniques that he pioneered, from the creative vision, the willingness to take enormous risks, making a movie about William Randolph Hearst being one of them. He's somebody that everybody in the movie business, I mean, he's been gone 38 years. Everyone in the movie business respects the hell out of Orson Welles. Citizen Kane, 83 years ago today, world premiere at the Palace Theater, the RKO Palace Theater in New York City. God bless Orson Welles. This has been episode 173 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here on this Wednesday early evening in New York. If you caught this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you caught this episode on the audio platform such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 174 real soon. Till then, peace.